For 2,000 years, the Celts were considered the original inhabitants of Western Europe, a single, unified people who built Europe's oldest civilization. But when geneticists extracted ancient genomes from Iron Age burial sites across Britain, France, and Ireland, the results revealed something nobody in mainstream history had been willing to admit. The people we call Celts were never one population. They were a collision of three forgotten ancestral groups whose true origin had been buried beneath centuries of myth, until a single genome study in 2023 pulled the truth out of the bone marrow of a 4,000-year-old skeleton. If you want the full evidence, peer-reviewed, sourced, and explained without the noise, subscribe now, because this channel breaks down genetic discoveries the textbooks have not caught up with yet. To understand why the Celtic identity was so misunderstood for so long, we need to go back to the people who created the myth in the first place. Ancient Greek and Roman writers, men like Herodotus, Julius Caesar, and Strabo, used the word Keltoi to describe almost any tribe living north and west of the Mediterranean. They were not anthropologists. They were chroniclers writing about populations they barely understood, and they treated cultural similarities, things like art style, weapon design, and language patterns, as proof of a shared bloodline. That assumption survived for 2,000 years. It shaped how Europeans saw their own ancestry and influenced national identities in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and France, yet none of it was based on biology. The first cracks in this old narrative appeared in the early 2000s, when researchers began sequencing ancient skeletal remains from across Iron Age Europe. The genetic material from a so-called Celtic warrior buried in Hallstatt, Austria, did not match the genetic material from a Celtic warrior buried in Cornwall, England. Their genetic distance was wider than expected. These were not relatives. They were members of populations that had developed in completely different parts of Europe and had only converged later through trade, migration, and military expansion. The real breakthrough came when scientists combined three separate fields of evidence. The team at the Francis Crick Institute, working alongside researchers from Trinity College Dublin and the Max Planck Institute, published a study in 2023 that traced Celtic ancestry to three distinct ancestral sources. The first was a population of Western European hunter-gatherers who had lived along the Atlantic coast for tens of thousands of years. The second was a wave of Anatolian farmers who entered Europe roughly 9,000 years ago, bringing agriculture and changing the entire genetic landscape of the continent. The third, and the most surprising, was a much later migration of pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the same group historians call the Yamnaya. The Yamnaya finding shocked researchers. These were horse-riding, cattle-herding warriors who swept westward into Europe around 4,500 years ago, carrying with them not just their genes, but the early ancestor of nearly every Indo-European language spoken today. When the Yamnaya entered Western Europe, they did not simply mix with the existing population. In some regions, especially Britain and Ireland, they replaced up to 90% of the male genetic lineage in just a few centuries. The people we now romanticize as ancient Celts were actually the descendants of a relatively recent demographic upheaval, written in violence, displacement, and population replacement. The genome studies also revealed something else nobody expected. Modern Irish, Welsh, Scottish, and Breton populations, the groups most often described today as Celtic, are not closer to ancient Celtic remains than other Europeans are. A modern person from Munich, Germany, often shares more genetic similarity with Iron Age Celtic remains from France than a modern person from Dublin does. The Celtic identity as it survives today is far more cultural than biological. Now, here is where the conversation shifts from history into something far more relevant for the modern world: the financial and economic side of these discoveries. The genetic ancestry industry has built itself almost entirely on the public's belief in clean ethnic categories. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and MyHeritage have generated billions of dollars in revenue selling reports that claim to identify how Irish, Scottish, Welsh, or Celtic a customer is. Yet the very studies that inform these companies' algorithms have now shown that those categories are far less stable than the marketing implies. The global consumer genomics market was valued at roughly $4.6 billion in 2024, and projections suggest it will pass $11 billion by 2030. But this growth is being threatened by the same scientific findings the industry once celebrated. Lawsuits over misleading ancestry results have already begun appearing in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. There is also the pharmaceutical angle. Drug companies have spent decades using broad European ancestry as a baseline for clinical trials, assuming Western Europeans share a roughly uniform genetic profile. The Celtic study has forced major pharmaceutical firms like Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and GlaxoSmithKline to rewrite parts of their genetic risk modeling. Personalized medicine, tailored to specific ancestral subgroups, is now one of the fastest-growing investment sectors in biotechnology. Venture capital firms in Boston, San Francisco, and London poured over $12 billion into precision genomics startups in 2024 alone, and ancient population research is one of the central pillars driving that investment. Even the tourism industry has felt the impact. Ireland, Scotland, and Wales have built billion-dollar heritage economies around the idea of Celtic ancestry. The Irish heritage tourism market alone generates over €6 billion per year, and any disruption to its core narrative carries real economic consequences. Tourism boards have quietly shifted their messaging, focusing more on culture, language, and tradition rather than direct biological lineage. The Celtic story, in the end, is not just a story about ancient people. It is a story about how scientific truth quietly reshapes industries that depend on older, simpler narratives. Genetics has done this before, and it will do it again. Every time it happens, billions of dollars shift, billions of beliefs collapse, and a new chapter of human identity begins. The Celts were never a single people. They were never one bloodline, one tribe, one origin. They were a fusion, a collision of hunter-gatherers who had walked the Atlantic shores for tens of thousands of years, farmers who carried Anatolian seeds across the continent, and steppe warriors who arrived on horseback with new languages and new gods. What the world calls Celtic identity today is not biology, it is memory, it is culture. It is a story humans tell each other to make sense of a past that is far messier than tradition allows. And as ancient genetic evidence continues to speak from skeletons buried for thousands of years, every old assumption about Europe's earliest civilizations will keep falling, one bone at a time. If you found this breakdown valuable, take a moment to support the channel before you leave. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join a growing community of viewers who care more about what the evidence actually shows than what tradition wants them to believe. Every video here is built on peer-reviewed research, sourced studies, and verified findings, so you can trust what you are learning. Drop a comment below and tell me which ancestral group surprised you the most: the Atlantic hunter-gatherers, the Anatolian farmers, or the steppe pastoralists. Share this video with someone who still believes the old story, because the truth deserves to travel. New evidence-based investigations come out every week, and the next one might rewrite a piece of history you thought was settled. Stay curious, stay critical, and I will see you in the next one.